Welcome to the Crisis Response Podcast, a show about the regular folks who are tackling major problems and transforming how communities watch out for each other. I'm Jason Friesen, and on the show today, how Gordon Casey and the Brave Co-op are building cutting-edge technology to detect opioid overdoses and activate life-saving community response in Vancouver, British Columbia. Hello, Gordon. Welcome to the Community Response Podcast. It is a real pleasure to have you. Where are we talking with you today?
I am in Vancouver, Canada, on unceded Coast Salish territory.
So tell us about Brave Co-op. What does Brave Co-op do? How'd you get started?
So Brave Co-op, we're the Brave Technology Co-op. We're focused on overdose detection. So that moment when somebody who's using drugs is most at risk of having an overdose, when they're actually consuming, we have a couple of different tools that will be connected to them so that if they do overdose, we can get help to them immediately.
That sounds like some truly life-saving technology. How did you come to this, to decide to start the Brave Co-op and get involved in this?
I was living in a place called Curacao in the Caribbean and noticed that the 911 response, well, not actually 911, but the emergency response there wasn't functioning at 100%, and discovered as I was looking for options to improve that Curacao was not unique in having this issue. So then in the course of trying to find ways to activate community response, I was looking at the number of different issues that were sort of falling through the gaps, as it were. And around the same time, we moved to Vancouver. This was 2016, the middle of 2016, and when fentanyl was really ramping up in the drug supply here in Vancouver, and the numbers of overdoses were reaching then record numbers. And people responded to me with my questions around what could this tool, a tool that activated community response for emergency or life-threatening situations, what could it be used for? People responded saying that the most pressing concern here and pretty much across the country and across North America was to activate some kind of overdose response.
So you then dove right into it.
And then I started talking to drug users and saying, we have this idea that technology could be of use. I took a bit of a step back from the ideas that I had around what the solution might look like. After a bit of a learning curve, I wasn't smart enough to do that immediately. But after a bit of a learning curve, asked them what could tech do, and did they think that it had a place? And what we learned, or what I learned, and what they sort of hammered into me, that people who use drugs hammered into me, was that most folks who are using alone are really, really likely to die if they overdose. And furthermore, they're very unlikely to have a friend who finds them call 911. If they do, they will call for community help first and foremost. And the numbers change and have changed over time, but at some points in time, it was high as 85% of overdoses were being responded to by non-EMS personnel, non-emergency service personnel. So then the mission became to develop and design tools with the people who would use them so that if you use alone and you overdose, that somebody will know about it. And then Brave will take care of the bit where we connect that to some kind of response, both community response and emergency response.
So what tools did this lead you to develop after doing some really immersive hands-on research and development?
We're lucky in Vancouver that we have legally sanctioned supervised consumption sites. They take a couple of different forms, but there's a lot of places here where people who are consuming illicit drugs like heroin and almost anything can go and be observed and be in a safe place where peers, volunteers, nurses, a whole swath of people will be there to look after them, not just if they overdose, but including if they overdose. We tried to just take that model because we know it works and we know that the community is familiar with it, and just replicate that in the form of an app. So the app is really remote supervised consumption. Somebody gets on a call with another human being, they tell them what they're consuming, they tell them what they expect their experience to be, and together those two humans figure out what the rescue plan is going to be for that person who's at risk of overdose. And they enter that information into their phone on their side, and we don't see that. That remains confidential and private to them unless and until they become unresponsive, at which point our side of things, the supporter will send a ping through to their app and say, please release that information to me. And if there's nobody to stop that from happening on their side, like if they are alerted that the information is going to be released and they don't cancel that release, then we see where they are, whether they're comfortable with 911 response or they only want a community response, and we immediately initiate that rescue.
So it sounds like I can imagine in the United States, a lot of places where you would face some significant pushback on such an idea. Mm-hmm. And likely in Canada as well. Can you talk about what kind of pushback you get and how you respond to that?
Yeah, so you're spot on. A lot of pushback, and not just in the States, even here in Vancouver, which some people call the harm reduction capital of North America. And people had concerns, and they're legitimate concerns, right? And I get that. So might somebody use the app who might have otherwise used a safer alternative, and then be at greater risk of overdose if something goes wrong? And as you will know from your work in this space, like, things can go wrong with technology. Human error is huge, but technological errors exist as well. So a phone battery might die, a connection might fall. At the exact moment when you're trying to send information across the technological line, something might fail along the way. And as you know, most of our work after building the initial thing is trying to ensure that none of that happens, to the extent that it's within our control, that everything that can go wrong does not go wrong, that we have alerts when things start to go wrong so that we can mitigate against those, et cetera, et cetera. So some of the concerns that people had were of that caliber, sort of the why would we want to move ahead with something that is a remote service when there is a real service? And of course, the answer to that is that not everybody has access to the real service, right? So even in a place like Vancouver, which has dozens of supervised consumption spaces, those are not accessible to everybody. Furthermore, if it's 3 o'clock in the morning, there's only one or two that you could use. If it's lashing down rain and it's 3 blocks to get to the nearest one, 3 blocks sounds really close when you don't have a single supervised, like legally sanctioned supervised consumption space in your country, but that's really far if it's lashing rain and you've got your drugs, and what you want to do is actually just settle in and consume them and get on with your life. So those arguments pretty much disappeared after COVID, because the number of overdoses went flying through the roof, but also the concept of remote, like telehealth, just became suddenly completely okay with everybody, including health authorities and so on. The more philosophical objections to what we're doing tend not to actually reach us, to be honest. We are somewhat sheltered from that due to the nature of the work that we're doing. We don't hear a lot from people who think that tools like this, or such as existing like physical infrastructure around supervised consumption, might be inappropriate or might be enabling or might increase the number of drug users in your community or something along those lines. And furthermore, the reality of technology and a tool like this, where it can be used by people from the safety and privacy of their own homes, means that we don't actually trigger a lot of those concerns. Which is not to say that we think we're better, but folks are strangely more comfortable with the idea of a technological solution, which is less in the face of constituents and not as politically or philosophically difficult for people to handle or understand why it might be useful to their community.
So this is really interesting. This is a real interesting take on not in my backyard. If they know it's happening in their backyard, they could be opposed to it, but if they don't know that it's happening in their backyard, no harm, no foul.
Or almost have plausible deniability, right? In a sense, like they can have some kind of defense against it.
Wow. Yeah, I had never considered that. That's really interesting. So when you and I first met, it was actually, I believe, back when the FDA had put out that contest. I think this was when, right? When the FDA had that challenge to find innovative mobile technologies to alert bystanders when someone had witnessed an opioid overdose.
Correct. Yeah.
And I remember back in those days, this was several years ago,
2016.
2016.
2016, 2017, yeah.
We were talking about the problem of unwitnessed overdoses, right? Because witnessed overdoses versus unwitnessed overdoses have different solutions for actually detecting and reporting the overdose, right?
Yeah.
A witnessed overdose is convincing people that they need to send for help if they don't have naloxone with them. But if it's an unwitnessed overdose, then there's nobody there to send for help. So how do you do it? And we were talking about a number of solutions. You had initially been working on that, but as I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, ran into significant challenges around it. Is that correct, as I remember it?
Yeah, so we developed just an MVP, like a minimum viable product of something that would call out for help. The problem, the mistake we made was everybody loved the idea. So we felt that we had sort of community buy-in and that it was the right thing to do. And we could see this problem with bystanders discovering an overdose. And we knew as well that the community was very frustrated, that the wider community in terms of the number of overdoses and feeling powerless to do something about it. And let's call them civilians would come across, like inexperienced overdose responders would come across somebody and wouldn't know what to do. And on the other hand, there are people literally just around the corner that are trained, that have naloxone with them. You don't necessarily have to wait for the ambulance to get there in order to deliver that first response. So we thought it would be great. So we developed this MVP and we rolled it out here in Vancouver. And that was the mistake, which we understood in hindsight. Vancouver in 2017 was probably the greatest density of naloxone in North America, possibly the world at the time. The BC CDC, so the British Columbian CDC, had engaged in this phenomenally successful take-home naloxone program, which they've calculated using some complicated math, must have saved thousands and thousands of lives. They just blanketed the province with naloxone, and that was sort of primarily here in Vancouver in the city. So it was the least likely place for anybody to actually need to have an app to summon for help. If we had gone somewhere more rural, if we had gone to places where naloxone really was gold dust and was hard to get hold of and only a few people had them, and they would use it only when they really knew it was necessary, or sort of hand it out only when they knew there's a really high likelihood of that person being in the presence of an overdose. If we'd gone there, we probably would have seen that catch on more. But just to remind you what I said earlier, that the sort of cost benefit of that, though, while that is a pity that we didn't learn that lesson and know that there was a place and time for those solutions, it did mean that we learned this other lesson, that really we want to target people who are using alone. That's anywhere between 80 and 95% of overdose deaths are people who were alone at the time that they used. So the understanding we came to as a result of that failure, that we really needed to serve those folks is it's priceless.
Right. So that's when you double down or really focus your energies on the virtual safe consumption sites.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so you developed this button, right? If you want to talk a little bit more about that, especially where you first rolled it out, and I remember that you had gotten a real early vote of confidence from Ohio.
Mhm.
And if you could talk a little bit about that, how that played out.
Yeah, so after we developed the app, we were talking with a few dozen different community groups here in Vancouver, drug user unions, and other other people who we thought should have an input into what was happening next. And one of the groups we met with was associated with one of the supportive housing operators here in Vancouver. And so it was about 12 people that would meet regularly, and we came and we said, here's this app that we've worked on, and what do you think? And we told them who we'd worked with so far, and they said, yeah, super cool, we love it. And this was the virtual supervised consumption app, so the existing app that we now have live. And they said, but for us living in supportive housing, it's probably not going to work very well. We live in older buildings, they're really small rooms, so finding us might be hard. The doors are usually locked, so you can't get access. You'd need to be connected to our front desk. And we have phones. We don't necessarily have the same phone all the time. We don't have the latest phone, so the app might not be compatible. And our data or Wi-Fi might not be strong enough to maintain a voice call for the length of time that's needed. So we worked with them for a while on an alternative, and that was the button that you mentioned. So at the time, a Bluetooth connected button that would connect to a sort of Wi-Fi and then internet connected hub that we built, so that anybody could push a button in their room. This would send a text message to the staff at the front desk well, I say downstairs, like usually downstairs, and staff would then know to go and check on that person. So again, it's virtual supervision. This isn't like an overdose button, right? In case some folks don't know, you don't have time when you overdose to push a button or make a call or do any of those things. It is possible, but that's maybe 2% of overdoses, where you'd feel it coming on and it would be slow and gradual enough for you to take some kind of action. So the idea is similar to putting on a seatbelt. You need to put on your seatbelt before you start driving, and you need to push your button or make your call on the app before you start using the drugs that would put you at risk of an overdose. And we had a lot of cynicism, both ourselves and from a lot of folks, about the likelihood of people using this during the pilot that we rolled out. But we met with the tenants. They were super excited about it. We met with the staff. They were also excited and had some legitimate concerns as well about buttons being pushed 25 times in an hour or something. And within the first 11 days of the buttons being rolled out in a small SRO here in Vancouver, 20 people, it was pushed over 100 times by those residents, and there were 3 overdoses that happened in that space of time. And as well as that, there were a number of incidents of safety concerns where people just had somebody else in their room, or they could hear something happening in the room next door, and they wanted to make sure that somebody came up and checked on them, helped them, or helped their neighbor. All of which everybody was astounded by. The sort of the engagement levels in us and staff and the sort of the nurses and other folks at the health authority and the city that we've been speaking to. And it was.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say it was shortly after that we applied for this Ohio competition, so the Ohio Opioid Technology Challenge, which was a huge chunk of money, and I think a very smart way for Ohio to sponsor innovation through sort of federal money and sort of grant money that had been allocated towards the opioid crisis. And they just took, it was a little less than 10% of the budget that they had for 1 year. And they just said, we'll turn this into a competition. And they got a huge response. Some really great innovative solutions came out of that. And we were honestly quite shocked to win 2 years in a row. So they had like 3 phases, and we won the second phase, and then we won the final phase as well. But as a harm reduction organization, we're the only harm reduction organization that participated in the challenge, and we were the only non-American. It was open internationally, but we were the only non-American participant as well.
Now I've never heard that before. You were the only harm reduction organization that participated in the challenge. Any clues as to why? You would think that it would be almost entirely harm reduction organizations applying. But is it because it was technology focused, or?
No. It's so this year, I think it was this year, was the first year that the US federal government has used the words harm reduction in its opioid strategy plan, or I think it's actually called the Overdose Strategic Plan. Things Yeah, I think in 2017, 2018, when they launched it, the competition, I think the primary or the cultural understanding of what the opioid epidemic was very much A, it's an opioid epidemic, it's not an overdose epidemic, and B, it was primarily due to overprescription. Canada had had not had the same experience as the US in that sense, and we had a very different understanding of it. And Vancouver was a bit of a canary in the coal mine in terms of understanding that fentanyl had completely changed the drug supply. A lot of this is because of harm reduction, because there's very active drug testing here and has been for quite a while. So when the change in the supply happened, people saw it and knew what was happening. So they weren't questioning why is there an increase in overdose that they were, but they understood that largely this was due to a change in the drug supply. Whereas for the rest of, or for a lot of the US and for some other parts of Canada as well, it took a lot longer for that realization to settle in, for it to be accepted. It's now very common for everybody in the States to talk about this as an overdose epidemic rather than an opioid epidemic. And harm reduction is just now sort of reaching the mainstream.
Interesting. So you win the competition 2 years in a row in Ohio, and what does that lead to for Brave?
I mean, that was our bread and butter and or meat and potatoes. That was everything for the last 3 or 4 years. We lived off that money for as long as we could. But we were able to develop the buttons and improve them, so they're no longer Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. They're now cellular and LoRaWAN. So I think that's low range wide area network or something, but a technology that's more appropriate for the kinds of buildings we're going into. It means we can have 1 or 2 routers per block rather than what would probably be more like 20 to 50 routers per block. That's exciting. And the cellular connectivity means we don't have to mess with our clients' Wi-Fi or get access to their credentials, or they don't have to set up extra special networks for us just to operate. It also meant we could develop another solution, which is our stillness sensor, which is primarily used in public restrooms. And that combines a door sensor plus a motion sensor powered by Doppler radar to determine if somebody is in the bathroom, first of all, and then if they're in the bathroom, if they're still moving. And if anybody stops moving, we send an alert out, get someone to come check on them.
Wow. That sounds like it could be really useful and in high demand by, and this isn't a joke, by fast food chains. When I was working as a medic, I remember when we got called to Carl's Jr. bathroom, we knew exactly what it was for. And yeah, so I mean, who's demand? Who's part of the demand for these? Who are you getting them into?
Currently, we're primarily going into community organizations, so people that have sort of a retail presence on Main Street, serving folks who they know are at risk of overdose, and they're people who already want to check on the bathrooms regularly, or if they see that somebody's been in there for 10 or 12 minutes, they're getting antsy and they want to make sure that everybody's okay. But they're very much the early adopters, right? We don't even need to sell this to them in any meaningful sense of the word. They react similar to how you did right now. They're just like, oh my God, I didn't know that this existed. Yeah. This is amazing. When can we get it? The conversations with retail, with like real retail, with food, fast food, and so on is taking longer to have for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned when you asked about or that you had in mind, I think, when you asked about the app. It's hard for those places to admit that their coffee shop or fast food location is a central place for drug use to take place. And if this is confusing for folks, that the reason why people who use drugs want to use in a bathroom is because it's private, and it means they can take their time and not be disturbed. If you're using on the street, there's always the chance that somebody will steal your drugs, somebody steal your other stuff if you happen to nod off for a minute or two. Whereas a bathroom is well lit, it means they can go slow, which is like something that will help them avoid other comorbidities or other sort of injuries they might do to themselves while they're injecting, if they're injection users. And it's just that much nicer. It's no judgment on anybody that they want to use in your bathroom. It just means you have a nice place. But yeah, it's hard for folks to admit that and to take a step that might be seen as inappropriate by some of their constituents or customers, etc.
So did you mention, I would assume that like homeless shelters might be in
Yeah.
high demand for what you've got.
Yeah. So any of the homeless shelters or temporary housing, if they have a shared bathroom, it's perfect for them, and they are exactly like you said. They're already concerned about this. They're trying to take steps already to ensure that their people are safe in their space, including in their washrooms. So this is just like, you've just like taken a burden off me. Now I can, I need to go and check when you send me an alert, but now I don't need to sort of grow a third eye out of my head so that I can try and see what's happening around the corner in the bathroom all the time.
Wow, that's one of those solutions where it's like right under your nose, you know.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. So I want to kind of switch gears here. You're the Brave Technology Co-op. What is a co-op?
Yeah, a question that many people ask, including like the tax authorities and people like that. So a cooperative it's an incorporated entity. So we're a legal person, as it were. We have legal personhood and limited liability. So it's those things. But instead of shareholders, we have members, and the members are almost like the citizens of a country. As a citizen of anywhere, you don't own that country. You're just a member who participates in the governance and the wealth and not wealth of your country. And members are the same. Different co-ops have different structures for who their members are or what entitles you to become a member. In Brave, or at Brave rather, we have 3 different kinds of members. So you can become a member if you work at Brave. So I'm a member by virtue of that. And you can become a member if you invest money in Brave. So we have a couple of investors, not a lot. So they're all members as well. And then anybody who uses our technology can also become a member. So you can probably figure out right away that the end user member numbers are going to vastly outnumber the people who work here and the people who invest in Brave. And that is very intentional. The idea is that they will have a much greater voting block than anybody else, and will therefore be able to control the direction of the company if we sort of go off the rails. And it's meant to achieve 2 things. The reason why we think that being a cooperative is a social justice, like an act of social justice, is to hand control over to the people that we claim we're trying to serve, and then they have the ability to hold us accountable. It also means that any financial surplus that we do make will be shared between those 3 groups as well. So there'd be some and co-ops use this word surplus instead of profit, but it on the one hand it's just words, but I do like it because it speaks to the fact that cooperatives are generally not out to make money. We're not a not-for-profit, but to call us a for-profit entity would also be not quite accurate or true. We want to survive, we want to be financially sustainable, and we really, really want to succeed in our mission and achieve impact. But any money that happens to be made on top of that is surplus, and it's really like the cup flowing over. And a bunch of that, a third of that, will get clawed back to the co-op to enable it to grow and so on, and the rest would be shared between all the members.
So how did you come to the decision? I mean, you briefly touched on this, but clearly there were a lot of deliberations that had to go on before you decided we're going to be a co-op. What was it, or when did that happen? How did that happen that you decided we're going to be a co-op versus for-profit or a non-profit?
I've had businesses before, not too big or anything, but I've had limited liability, regular structures. They always seem kind of broken to me. I've had some experience in the startup field as well, and they seemed weird too. Those structures and the conversations that would inevitably happen about who is getting what and whether shares should be increased to one person or another, and one of them that I was working with had a really generous founder who just kind of shared things much in the same way as would happen if it had been a co-op. It wasn't. It was just his way of doing of work and sort of being in the world. And I wanted to kind of emulate that and ensure that the people who really contributed in one way or another to the success of the co-op or the enterprise would be rewarded for that and would have some control over that. I was fascinated by cryptocurrencies when I was thinking about this, and could see that they were building in ways for people to participate in the growth and so on, to have it be repaid automatically. And I mentioned this to a friend, that this is what I was thinking, trying to build something that was fair, and I had in mind something with crypto and something with nonprofit holding companies and different shareholder rights and stuff. And he said, I think you're describing a cooperative. And I said, what are you talking about? And the only co-ops I had heard of were the sort of the corner store in the UK. That those are usually co-ops, and here in North America, sort of what's it called, REI, and some other sort of producer co-ops.
And apartment buildings in New York City.
Which one? Sorry.
Apartment buildings in New York City.
Okay.
Co-ops.
And so I looked into what is still known as the platform co-op movement, which is very much about digital cooperatives. And the stuff I read there was very aligned with what I was thinking. It took me a while to really digest how transformative a cooperative could be, or more to the point, how transformative an economy which embraced cooperatives could be at the large scale. A lot of us would argue that it's kind of what the world needs right now. The decision to continue on this, just as we got greater direction and clarity on our vision of what Brave was going to be, it made even more sense to ensure that we were returning any power and trust that was being given to us by the people who use drugs and are at risk of overdose, and those that serve them at the front lines, that we could return that back to them in the form of giving them democratic voting rights within the co-op, and again, the sort of financial surplus if that ever happens.
So how many members are there in your co-op now?
We are just over 50 at the moment, but we have a backlog of about 100 that we need to process and get into the co-op. We've, as I'm sure you're familiar with, we have a whole bunch of governance stuff that we need to catch up on, and it sadly never makes it to the top of my pile. So.
Yes, I can understand that. So now, how many programs or how many locations are you active in?
Those are good questions, which I should update myself on. I think we have 65 sites with the sensors right now. We have 550 rooms with buttons, and we have about 5,000 folks who've used the app at one time or another. All of those numbers, except for the app, are growing by about 2x over the next couple of months. So we have as well, like a backlog of orders to fulfill. Nothing horrendous, but we are subjected to the supply chain woes. A lot of our technology comes from far across the seas, and it's a bit of a process to get them here. But that's exciting. So we'll be in well over 1,000 rooms by the end of the year, well over 100, I think about 200 bathrooms by the end of the year as well. And those sites are all catching overdoses every week or two. Something, there's another one or two that's happening, and it's exciting, it's depressing. It's, doing this work is often sort of, I don't quite know what the word is, but you often are feeling joy at things that are not joyful, in the sense that you're catching an overdose and reviving that person, which is wonderful, but you still feel that the other side of that, which is the sadness that it had to happen in the first place.
That's absolutely right. I say that, I find myself saying that all the time when we have programs, especially new programs launching. Mm-hmm. And it's very gratifying to be part of the solution, but it's also very depressing because you begin to really see how big of a problem it is.
Right. Yeah.
One of the organizations that we support in called Safe Nest in Las Vegas is dealing with domestic violence. And it is very gratifying to be able to support them in what is such an awesome mission, but then to learn about the scale of domestic violence is really depressing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I totally get what you're saying. What is the near term, what's your 2 to 3 year goal? People ask me all the time, what's your 5 year plan? And I'm like, I can barely think 6 months ahead. Of course, we have our 5 year plan, but practically speaking, the most I'm thinking is 18 months. So if you will suffer me, what is your 18 to 24 month plan? Where are you hoping to be in 1 to 2 years?
I think definitely on with the devices, we're hoping that within the next 6 months or so, that we're putting up an e-commerce site and we're doing things like that, and we need to do a bit more to get the word out about the work that we're doing and what's available. So I would hope that by the 18 to 24 month mark, anybody who really needs this in their site, in their location, in their shelter, in their community center, that group of customers that we're trying to serve, that they would just know about us and would be able to go on the site, and if they want the things for their location, they can just push a button and get it like very quickly. And at the moment, everything is still quite labor intensive in terms of me having conversations with folks and walking them, holding their hand through the discovery process so they fully understand what it would look like in their building, etc. We want to convert that to videos and blogs and just documentation, and whether it's just illustrations or something, so they understand that intuitively very quickly and can quickly come to a decision as to whether it's a good fit, and then go and find the money to do it. You and I have spoken about this before, but our pricing strategy is to make our stuff as cheap as possible so that it can get out to as many people as possible as quickly as possible. So we really do want to be ubiquitous in the greatest sense. So if this fits with people's philosophy and their approach and their culture, then there's no reason for this not to be there, helping them sort of fight the overdose epidemic on their own doorstep.
So right now you're working with individual locations, right? You're working with housing, you're working with homeless shelters. Is there an end state, like an ideal partner that you're working towards? I'm specifically thinking about municipalities, right? Is that the goal, to be signing agreements with entire communities, or do you see yourselves just always staying at the end user level?
No, so there's very much three of us involved in almost all of these conversations, and it's us, and it's the end user or end client, let's say, and then their funder. And I'd say maybe 25% of the time we don't know who that funder is. It's somebody visible, or a donor or some philanthropist of some sort. But most of the time we know that it's some kind of governmental body or pseudo-governmental body or something along those lines. The ideal situation is for those folks to offer the funding and backing and potentially training and sort of onboarding for our systems to not just the one end user that we're talking to, but to everybody within their circle. So an example could be the city of San Francisco, where we do have some buttons and sensors deployed, might decide to let every supportive housing operator in the city have access to our tools, and they would pay for it. Or they would provide them with, they wouldn't pay us directly, but they would provide them with the money to be able to pay for these tools. And it's honestly like it's not feasible for us to do it any other way. And those are the more interesting conversations that we're starting to have with some city, county, and state bodies across the US.
What types of problems or issues do you see in the United States that you don't see in Canada, or vice versa? I think a lot of people in the United States don't fully understand the differences, particularly when it comes to public health between Canada and the United States. And of course, the United States, right? We're 50 states, and there is a spectrum of attitudes and behaviors and beliefs on this topic. But I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about a few of the bigger differences that you see between working in Canada and working in the United States.
I think it's mostly what you said at the end there. It's such a spectrum in the US, and in Canada it's still a spectrum. We have, things are done differently in each province and territory,
Right.
But the federal approach is very similar. Like it's public health across the board. Harm reduction is the official policy of Canada and has been for I think 12 years now, 12 or 13 years. It's called the Vancuver model. So that part is relatively, you can at least appeal to that in Canada. In the States, there are places in the US, lots of places in the US, where it's still illegal to have naloxone on you, because that's still considered drug paraphernalia. The FDA just this week changed the requirements around mass prescription of naloxone or mass distribution of naloxone, so that harm reduction organizations can do a whole bunch of things that they haven't been able to do for the past ever, which is great. But things like that are obviously huge barriers, and are unlikely to change in the near future. So there was an event, the National Harm Reduction Coalition had an event in New Orleans in 2018, and the saddest thing to me about the conversations I had was that when I was talking to, for example, some groups from North Carolina, they were bemoaning the fact that their syringe service program had just been shut down, and they were going to have to find a way to work around the new sort of legal requirements or restrictions. So that was their next thing, was they want to get back to where they were. And then Philadelphia, on the other hand, was working really hard to get a legally sanctioned, supervised injection site opened and operational in Philly. And Canada was starting to talk, I think they were starting to talk about what we call safe supply here. So a more open ability for medical grade opioids and other drugs for folks, so that they're not using the illicit street supply, which we know is going to be tainted. And everybody sort of thought that the next thing that they were after was kind of the silver bullet. So they're all looking forward to that and aspiring to that. And they would talk to somebody who had like 25 syringe service programs, and they're sitting like, oh, you have it so lucky. But that's not the reality, right? Like the reality is not that the next thing is going to save you. It's just a different problem, which I think it's like having kids. Like it never actually gets better. It just gets different. Like the problems from changing diapers and potty training to words and language and school and girlfriends and boyfriends and puberty. So that makes it challenging because you don't know who you're talking to, you don't know what their challenges are, and it can seem like Vancouver has like all the answers, and I promise you we don't, or that we have all the services, and we definitely do not, and everything is still a struggle. Here, everywhere, everybody's still struggling, and this possibly sounds radical to some folks, but like until the war on drugs is ended. And the new president of Colombia gave a very interesting speech at the UN, either on Monday or maybe it was last week, about the need to end the war on drugs, and otherwise it's going to kill how many more Americans and how many more people in Latin America from this. And that's what we believe too, and that's also not going to change anytime in the near future. So in the meantime, everybody's going to be struggling with different things. Which makes it hard to unify folks as well, because it seems from a distance like everybody's asking for different things, but it's because everybody's in a different place right now.
Absolutely. I think that's important too. Thank you for making that point, that Canada is not a monolith in terms of their approach, and they certainly have a spectrum as well. I think that they have a socialized healthcare system certainly separates them from the United States, though clearly in the United States we have aspects of our healthcare system that are very much in line with a socialized healthcare system. But that's not for this discussion. So, for other organizations that are looking to get involved in community response or that are already involved in community response, I'm wondering if you have any lessons learned, or maybe, well, yeah, lessons learned in terms of you went down the road with this in mind and then found out that wasn't the case. Do any of those stand out to you, that where you had to change course and you thought you were going to have an advocate in this corner but found out they weren't advocates, but maybe there was somebody else?
I think, I mean, the one big lesson that we've learned is most of the people that we are trying to serve and help are severely under-resourced. And so a lot of the conversations that we have are, to a certain extent, really aspirational on their part. They see what we're doing, they know that it would serve their community, and they want the outcomes that would happen if this were fully operational, up and running, and working at 100%, or with 100% engagement from their community. But to get from here to there is not there's no technology that can do that, and there's very little the brave can do to make that easier, like really easier. We can we can make videos to explain things, we can do all of those things, but the really heavy lifting is going to be done on the ground with the frontline workers, and it's just a lot. And people don't, out of a sense of optimism and just hope, and like not wanting to feel that everything is hopeless, and people don't necessarily see that at the time that they're initially considering what these tools, any of these tools, might mean for them and their community and the people that they're trying to serve. And it's just hard. So all of which to say, we've had a lot of conversations with a lot of amazing frontline folks over the years that nothing has come of it, and we still love them. And I know from the few times that we do manage to catch up with them again later, we know that they still love us and would want it to be there. They just do not have the time. Never mind any money, and usually we have a lot of free tools, so usually it's not the money part, it's just the time and the resources to make things happen and to move the needle.
Makes sense. Could you share any lessons learned about technology development? We find a lot of organizations aspire to create their own technology solutions, and that's what we did, right? And that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if, I meet organizations all the time where they're like, we're thinking about doing software ABC or hardware XYZ. Do you have any suggestions for them or any lessons learned?
Yeah, so many. We built our app about 3 times before we settled, or this the third one. The third team we found was the right one. So it's expensive, and I don't know if there's a figure, but it's probably 5 to 10 times whatever you've been told it's going to cost you is what it's going to cost you, and that's just the money. That's not the blood and the sweat and the tears that come with that, or the hair pulling from the frustration or just lack of ability to understand one another. I think it's hard because when you have a vision for something, it's really hard to see that the things that are already out there in the world are 80% of what it is that you're looking for. But that's usually the case. I actually wish that we'd started with a phone line. So there's a phone line in the States called Never Use Alone. There's a phone line here in Canada called the National Overdose Response Service, which we launched with a partnership with some groups in Ontario. But that would have been a great way for us to learn a bunch about the app and what needed to go into it and what would be beneficial, and to differentiate between what people told us was important and what was actually important on the day. But we didn't think of that, like literally didn't think of it. I thought of WhatsApp groups and I thought of other things like that, which we did try and didn't fly, but a phone line would have worked. So any way that you can test your hypotheses without building an app or a website or something more complicated, do try that. And then that's free advice. That's worth the price of what it is. But it's hard to take seriously, and I understand that, like especially if you're creatively inclined or Or you have a vision and you have a passion, and doing something like a phone line is like, there's nothing sexy about that. And so it's hard to take that. And yeah, I guess, 5 times the cost, and also 5 times as long, right? Before you actually get from something that you've dreamed of to something that you can put out there into the public's hands.
I would agree with everything you said, and 5 to 10 times what you expected for the beta, right? Like just to get to
Just
your
that,
MVP.
just usable. Yeah.
Yeah. And then all of the continuous improvements and people like to look at your technology and make suggestions, which are oftentimes very, very helpful. But I find people, one, have a tendency to overestimate the utility of these things, and also underestimate the effort that it takes.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. There's the money, and then there's the time. And you may not be paying yourself to be the product manager, but your time does have a financial equivalent. So I think those are all really good recommendations or lessons learned. So I really appreciate all your time. It's always great catching up with you. Is there anything else you'd like to share about Brave that we didn't get to, or for aspiring organizations that hope to follow in your footsteps, or at least follow a similar path?
No, just to offer myself as a resource. I do actually love chatting with other folks who are founders in the same or adjacent industries, and anybody who loves humans and wants to, and our planet, and like wants to keep us going and show some kindness to the world. I'm more than happy to have a chat. Gordon@brave.coop. That's my email address. It's all over the internet. Not hard to find. But yeah, there's more of us. We need to collaborate more, and sometimes collaboration is just a conversation and sharing stuff, and we're very open and transparent. We try to be with all of our stuff.
No doubt about that. You have been a consistent and constant source of assistance and inspiration for many years. So I really appreciate it. And hopefully folks will reach out to you.
Likewise, Jason, as I hope you know.
Thanks a lot, Gordon. Always a pleasure.
Take care.